This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so good evening, everyone, and welcome back to a fresh new session for interest modeling. And we were talking about the capital structures, right? So of the bank. And while we were talking about the capital structure of the bank, there were some important points which we needed to observe. So we spoke about the different tiers of capital, the different pillars of capital that are there, different tiers of capital. We spoke about the tier one capital, the tier two capital, the components of tier one and tier two capital. And from there, what we started talking about, so we had talked about the unsecured. So we were talking about the different components of tier one and tier two capital there, right? So we spoke about tier one capital. After we spoke about tier one capital, so from tier one capital we started talking about the tier two capital, and we tried exploring the key differences that was there between tier one and tier two capital. So one of the points that we saw was that, so one of the biggest advantage that tier one capital had was the was on the element of transparency, right? So there was this common form of this capital across the world. And it's highly transparent form of capital, and is the implication of profitability of the bank, right? So over here, what we have is the implication of so over here in terms of this implication of this profitability of the bank. So we have the you know we have the so basically this gives us an in detailed idea about the profitability of the bank, right? So So this is something that we have over here, right? So over here, one of the points that we have is so one of the biggest difference that we saw between tier one and tier two capital was that you facilitate. So was that the tier one capital was a very transparent form of capital, and the other that I had is the transparent form of capital, and initially it's the implication of the profitability of the bank and so on, right? So given that this tier one capital is such a core form of capital, so what we do over here is we try to look into the important capital ratios, right? So that is one of the points. Now the next thing that we spoke about is because tier one capital is such a core or a pure form of capital, therefore it is also therefore it is very important that we look into each of these into this capital, right? So there was this capital. So therefore there are three very important capital ratios which are computed, right? And each of these capital ratios form a very critical part initially in assessing the capital adequacy, and later on while stress testing, right? So over here, the first point that I have is the tier one common ratio. So let's try to talk about what the tier one common ratio is. So let's try to take up each of these capital ratios, and also on the tier two side, we saw that most of them were undisclosed reserves, revaluation reserves, but uh, be it the general provisions or the revaluation or these reserves. So, but one of the things that was there is that these were kind of unreported or estimated figures, and therefore we cannot expect to absorb unexpected losses using these measures. That is why tier one capital always remains on the forefront when it talks about absorbing or reserving for unexpected losses. While I talk about tier one common ratio, so while I talk about tier one common ratio, so one of the important points that comes out over here is that you have the tier one common ratio, we have the common equity tier one, and the leverage ratios. So these are the three broad ratios that we have, right? So this is as far as what we had done in the last class. So in today's discussion, I'll start off with with each of these important tier one capital ratios. So one very important point which we observed in the last class was that tier one and tier two capital in the tier one tier two capital, tier two capital could never exceed the tier one capital, right? So we looked into the tier one common ratio. So we look to, so therefore we look into tier one capital as a very important. Right. So on one side that we have over here is the tier one. So we'll take up each of these capital ratios and we'll define each of them. We'll identify why these are important, and then from there what we'll do is we'll go on to talk about the different kind of exposures that a bank is exposed to, and the exposures from where each of these capital, the that has to be set aside, and from there we'll see what are the different exposures that are there that a bank has, what are the broad kind of exposures which has been discussed under the Basel framework, and from there we'll start moving towards the next steps. So let's start off with tier one common ratio. So let's first define this tier one common ratio. So how do you define the tier one common ratio? So what is the common ratio? So common ratio is it's coming from the common equity. So basically what it tries to see that out of the total equity that the bank has, the how much of it is composed of the common equity, because the common equity, as we know, gives an ownership or entitlement of ownership to to these people, uh, to the shareholder, right? So therefore, it is very important that that this common ratio is identified, because this common ratio is a measure. It is a measure of the core equity of the bank. So this is a measure of the core equity of a bank. The measure of the core equity of the bank. Core equity of the bank. Right. So it's the measure of the core equity of the bank. Right. So how do you actually calculate this? So this is tier one common ratio. Is the tier one common ratio. So when I talk about the tier one common ratio, so this is the common equity in the tier one capital. Common equity in tier one capital. Okay. So common equity in tier one capital divided by the total size of the risk weighted assets, or the RWA as we call it. So this shows that out of the total risk weighted assets that the bank has on its books, out of the how much of the common equity tier 1 capital is there, so how much of this can be absorbed by the equity that the bank has. So this is divided by this is the tier 1 common ratio, which is the common equity in tier 1 divided by the risk weighted assets, right? So what does this measure talk about? So this measure is nothing but the measure of the financial strength. So this particular measure will measure the financial strength of the measures the financial strength, measures the financial strength. So it measures the financial strength, right? Now the next part is, so this part does not include the preferred share. It is only that common equity that the bank has, right? Now, this is a measure of the financial strength, and as a result, this measure, the tier 1 common ratio, is also a measure of the capital adequacy that the bank has. It is a measure of the capital adequacy of the capital. Sorry. So this is a measure of the capital adequacy that the bank has. It is a measure of the capital adequacy that the bank has. So regulators would like to look into this tier 1 common ratio as a measure of the financial strength, as a measure of the capital adequacy that the bank has. Right? Right. So we have this measure of the financial strength, measure of the capital adequacy, the tier 1 common ratio, and so on. So we have this part. Right. Now, once we have this particular part, the next portion which comes out over here is that so after the tier 1 common ratio, we talk about the common equity tier 1. So it consists of the following elements: common shares, stock surplus, and so on. Right. So we have been talking about the common equity. So how much of this common equity, so or how exactly is this equity calculated? What are the components that is there as a part of the equity, right? Or what are the ones, what are the components which go into to calculate or help us calculate the equity? So basically within this common equity, the common equity that we have over here, number one of them is the CET. So one of them is the uh, common shares which are issued by the fund. Okay. So one of them is the common shares which are issued by the banks, right? Okay. The second part that we have over here is a stock surplus or a share premium. So what we have over here is a stock surplus or a share premium. The stock surplus or the share premium, right? So the next part that we have over here is uh, we have the retained earnings. The retained earnings. Okay. The next point that we have over here is the accumulated other comprehensive incomes. The accumulated value of the other comprehensive incomes, etc. So we have a lot of these different heads which go in accumulated other comprehensive income. So when we have a look into this, so what we have is we can clearly see that the capital structure of the bank, the capital structure that a bank typically has. Now this capital structure is given. So what we are trying to see here with what are the feeders or what are the components which enter into to create this capital structure. So other comprehensive income and so on. So these are now observe that now if you see these that these are the key sources of income for the bank as well. Or if I'm adding retained earnings, if I'm adding accumulated capital of other comprehensive income. Now, these are the factors which will get impacted during macroeconomic stress situations, and as a result, your equity capital and your capital ratios tend to get stressed. So that's the overall idea that we have over here, right? So that's how common equity. So that's what common equity is. Now the next component is the leverage ratio. Now this leverage ratio has to play a very critical role under Basel III. We'll come to that. But over here, the first question is what is the leverage ratio? How do I define this leverage ratio? So the leverage ratio is divided. It's very simply defined as dividing the tier one capital ratio by the firm's total consolidated assets. So this is the leverage ratio is the tier one capital, the tier one, the tier one capital ratio. So the total amount of capital, tier one capital that you have as a part of your total capital, or the tier or total tier one capital divided by. So this includes both. So leverage ratio will include both preference as well as common shares divided by the firm's average consolidated asset. Average consolidated assets. Consolidated assets. Right. So over here we have the tier one capital divided by the firm's average consolidated assets. So this is tier one capital, and this is the leverage ratio. So what it tries to show is that to what extent can the firm leverage up its capital base. right? So let's say if this is X, so what it means is if the firm's asset size is 100 rupees, the tier 1 capital is X times 100 rupees. So out of what proportion of this is a sufficient proportion? So we have the regulatory capital cutoffs, the ratio cutoffs over there. So this is the tier 1 leverage ratio. Now this leverage ratio is something which has become very important, which has become very important under Basel 3 as well, right? So these are the three capital ratios. These are the core three capital ratios which talk about or which help us capture the bank's capital adequacy, as well as it helps us capture the bank's ability to leverage up its capital, leverage up its capital. So that's the part that we have been talking about, right? So over here, the entire idea of doing this exercise is to identify the key factors which are the three heart of the three key points which lie at the heart of this entire capital impairment analysis. You are doing all these capital and impairment analysis to ensure that these three capital ratios are sufficiently kept. So you're trying to estimate at a group level that what is the estimate of this tier one common ratio, what is the idea of this common ratio and so on. So that's the part that you are trying to actually capture, right? So all PD models, LGD models, EAD models that you are going to build, your ultimate objective is to capture calculate the capital ratios, calculate the capital and see the amount of capital that has been kept relative to the risk-weighted asset, how likely, how nice or how unnice it is. I mean, how adequate or inadequate this relationship is. So that's the part that we need to address. Right? Now, in fact, whenever a stress testing exercise is also done, it's what we try to test over here in the when macroeconomic scenario change is the amount of capital which has been kept by the bank sufficient enough such that these regulatory capital ratios have some substantial amount or they are sufficient enough to to absorb these macroeconomic shocks. So that's the part that we are trying to talk about, right? So any questions up to this point? So any questions up to this point? So you can just go through this once and then you can say. I'll go on mute. You can have a look. You have a look at it for a minute and then we'll continue. Okay, fair.
Actually, I have one. Hi, Tanmay. I have one query. So it's the tier one common equity and common equity tier one. So in common equity tier one, in addition to the common shares, we are also taking the stock surplus, return earnings, and accumulated income into consideration. And is the formula same? The denominator, is it risk weighted assets for that also?
Yeah. So this common equity tier 1 that you are calculating from here, that is entering into tier 1 common ratio. So that the numerator that you have in common ratio is the common equity tier 1 capital. So you are calculating the common equity using these heads. Getting the common equity, you are putting it in the ratio and you are getting the tier 1 common ratio, so which becomes the capital adequacy ratio.
Okay. Once more, your voice was getting muffled. Can you repeat once, if it's not a
Yeah,
problem?
sure. Absolutely, absolutely. So what I'm saying is that the common equity tier 1 is calculated by adding all these, right? So once you get that common equity tier 1, that is fed into the tier 1 common ratio. So the numerator of this tier 1 common ratio is the common equity tier 1 capital. So
Okay,
this common
got it.
equity tier 1. So that
Yeah,
enters
got it.
as put into tier 1 common ratio.
Yeah,
And
got it.
from there, you are calculating the tier 1 common ratio, which is the capital adequacy uh, tier.
Got it.
Okay. Fine. So we'll move on to the next. So now, once we have identified this key capital ratios, and we know that we need to ensure that that those ratios are sufficient, that they are sufficiently stable, and that they are sufficiently adequate. So given that we have identified that, so the next question that comes out to us over here is that how do we, you know, so basically, if I have to do this, right? So I'll do it at a group level. Now, if I have to do it now, I need to calculate this capital, the return earnings and all everything at a portfolio level, at an exposure level, and then aggregate them up at the bank level, right? So if I am doing this, the first thing that I need to understand is that what exactly are the portfolios that the bank has? What are the different kind of exposures to which a bank is exposed to? So what are the broad kind of exposures? Right. So that is something that we would want to first understand, right? So before we talk about all these measures and everything, so the first few things that we need to address over here, the first few things that we need to understand over here is that how exactly is it that these exposures are created? So how exactly is it that these exposures are there together? Okay. So the next question that I have over here is the risk exposures, key risk exposures of the key risk exposures and their respective definitions. The key risk exposures, right? So broadly, when I talk about the key type of risk exposures, right? So broadly, there are five types of exposures with the BCPS guidelines talk about. So the first set of exposure that I have is the corporate exposure. So is the corporate exposure. The corporate exposure. The second that I have over here is the sovereign exposure. The second set of exposure that we have over here is the sovereign exposure. The third set of exposure that we have over here is the bank exposure. The third exposure that I have is the bank exposure. The fourth exposure that we have over here is the retail exposure. The retail exposure. And the final that I have over here is the equity exposure. The equity exposure. So these are the five broad exposures that we generally want. Right now, in our credit risk modeling module, the hands-on part that we'll talk about or that we mostly focus on will not be focused on all of them, right? So we will be mostly be focusing on the corporate exposure, and we will be focusing on the retail exposure mostly. But we will be exploring the classes or the types of each of these exposures. But our key area of focus will be the corporate and the retail exposures. Right. Now, the corporate exposures are further divided into five subclasses. So there are five subclasses, and the retail exposure has three subclasses. So these are the two things that we need to understand in details. We just need to detail them out a little, right? Okay. So one hand, what I have is the retail exposure. On the other hand, what I have is the corporate exposure. Within the corporate exposure, I have five subclasses. With the retail exposure, I have three subclasses. Right. So we will be talking about each of So on one hand, what I have here, so we'll take up each of these exposures, we'll define them, and from there we will see how to uh, identify, so how to work with them. Right. So we'll first talk about the corporate exposures. We'll talk about the retail exposures, and so on. So let's start off with the corporate exposures first. The corporate exposures. The corporate exposures. It's 9 o'clock. Okay. So over here, what we have are the corporate exposures. So corporate exposures. Before we start off with corporate exposures, just give me a minute's time. I'll just be back and we'll get started. I'll just pause the recording for a minute and then we'll resume it as soon as I get back.
This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. So welcome back, guys. After the small pause. So we just before this short break, we were talking about the corporate exposures. Now, when you talk about corporate exposures, the first point is we need to define what a corporate exposure is as per the BCBS guidelines. The second point is that we need to understand what are the type of products or what are the kind of business lines which come under the corporate exposures. Right. So basically, let's first start by defining the corporate exposures. Because the way the corporate exposures are defined and the way the retail exposures are defined in the guidelines, that to a large extent determines the way that these two are modeled. Okay. So first, let's define a corporate exposure. So the most at a very basic level, it is nothing but the exposure is nothing but a debt obligation. Now, what kind of a debt obligation to what kind of an entity do we get the debt obligations for? The debt obligations are seen for the following types of the entities. Now, the type of entity that I'm measuring over here, this type of entity that I'm talking about, will determine the type of people that is there or the scope of this portfolio. So, debt obligations by proprietorship. the proprietorship, the partnership, and the corporation. So these are the three broad right. So over here we have these three broad kind of debt obligations. We have the proprietorship, with a partnership and corporation. So these are the three broad, or so broadly each of the, so proprietorship is the smallest of the entities of a corporate entity, and corporates are the corporations are the largest entity, right? So these are the, so this is the variation of the exposure. So it starts from a right from a proprietorship right up to a corporation. Each of the firms, each of these type of firms fall under a corporate exposure or a corporate portfolio, right? Now, while we talk about this, okay, so while we talk about this, we need to find out a way to, you know, to find out a way to identify these entities, so uh, which, so, so basically, so there's a way to classify this or to further classify this corporate exposure. So one is the small and medium enterprises and medium enterprises. The small and medium enterprises. And the next part that I have over here are the corporates. Right. So when I talk about the small and the medium corporates, so small and medium enterprises, right? So the next part was the proprietorship and the partnership and so on. So proprietorship and partnership together they come around as small and medium enterprises. Now the next part that we have to this is the corporates or the corporations. So now the question is that how do you define the small and medium scale enterprises? So this is, so anything which is less than 50 million euro, which has a 50 million euro of sale proceeds. Okay. So in terms of the sale proceeds, if it is less than 50 million euro, then that's small and medium sized enterprises. For corporates, right? So anything which is greater than equal to euro 50 million in terms of their sale proceeds is a corporate. Okay, so I have these two exposures, right? So any exposure, so any the exposures of any obligor whose sales proceeds or whose sales turnover is less than 50 million euro, right? So then that is not flagged as an SME. As if it is more than 50 million euro or reported sales of the group, then it is a corporate, right? So when I talk about sales proceeds in terms of accounting, how do you define this sale proceeds? So this sale proceeds is defined as consolidated reported sales of the consolidated consolidated reported sales. Right. So this is the consolidated reported sales of the entity. So when I talk about the sales proceeds, what I'm essentially talking about is the consolidated reported sales of the entity. Right. Okay. Now this corporate exposure, there are five broad type of exposures, or there are five subclasses of this exposure. So there are five subclass of this exposure. Okay. So you have five subclasses of this corporate exposure. What are the five subclasses? The first subclass that I have over here is the project finance. Now, the project finance is a typical example of a corporate portfolio. So one of the part that we have over here is project finance. So what exactly is project finance? How will the cash flows come in for project finance? How will the repayments be done? When will a borrower turn out to be a defaulter? When the borrower is not turned out to be a defaulter? These are some of the questions that we are trying to address. So over here, the first is project finance. The second that I have over here is the concept of an object finance. The second set of exposure that I have over here is the object finance. The second part that I have over here is, okay, so on one side I have the project finance, the second side I have the object finance, and the next that I have over here is the concept of income producing real estate. So over here what we have is, so we have the income producing. Okay, so as I was saying, right, so income producing real estate. Okay, so over here we have the income producing real estate. Sorry. So we have the income producing real estate. Okay, so these are three broad types. One is the income producing real estate, the other is the object finance, and third is the project finance, right? Now, so from apart from this, so from this there would be yeah. So each of the under each of the subclasses, so what we need to look up what the other subclasses, and from there you try to find out those which are. So we try to describe those. So which so those are that needs to be looked right. So we'll have the project finance, object finance, and finally what we have over here is the concept of the commodity finance. So the next that I have over here is the commodity finance. So over here, what we also have is the commodity finance. Okay. So the next part that we have over here is the commodity finance. Now these are the four critical segments which needs to be looked at, right? So these are the four segments. So the next part that I have over here is the high volatile commercial real estate part. So these are the four major exposures to which a bank has. And over here, our objective will be to look at the focus and maybe a bit of finance, and then finally look up the income producing real estate. And and each of these, so while we talk about each of these frameworks, we will also be talking about how exactly is it that this finance is taken. Right. So from where does the cash flow come in? How is the securities adjust to it? What are the challenges that we face? What are the challenges that this will take?
Tanmay, which is the fifth subclass? You have mentioned
The
four.
fifth subclass, yeah, the fifth subclass arises from the income producing real estate. It is the high volatile commercial real estate.
Okay, okay.
I've come to the difference between the income producing and the high volatile commercial estate. So just let me write that also. This is the highly volatile commercial real estate. Highly volatile commercial real estate.
Then my CNI roles loans will be part of object finance or what? I mean the corporate and institutional loans.
Which one?
The corporate and institutional loans of the commercial portfolios, they will be featured in where? Project finance is, I mean, you can say that construction will be featured there. So what is object finance? Equipment finance, is that so?
So object finance, what you are doing is, can you just tell me the full form? CNI is commercial and
Corporate and institutional or
as a
commercial
corporate
industrial.
commercial investment loans, right?
Yeah, commercial loan. Let's say Amazon wants a loan
Uh-huh.
and they come to bank and we will give them a loan. So what type of
Okay.
loan is that?
That will fall somewhere around between project finance and object finance, depending on the nature of the lending.
Okay. I mean, what they want to do with that, right? The money.
what they want to do with that, and how exactly is it that that transaction is structured.
All right.
So, for example, let's say Amazon wants to buy their own fleet, or let's say buy their own cars for employee service, so employee cab services. So Amazon comes to the bank and takes a loan for buying 30 sumos, or let's say 30 Novas. So when they do that, so that's an case of object finance, because you are taking the loan specifically to buy a set of objects for commercial purposes. So the way the purpose or the way in which that loan will be taken or the loan will be designed is something that we would be looking at, is something that we would be talking about. Right. So the next part, so while we talk about this exposure, the next part over here will be to define each of these projects. So over here it would be first to define each of these exposures. What are the key characteristics of these exposures? And the first part that we start off with, in this commercial portfolio description, is the description of the project finance. So project finance. So how do I define this? So in a project finance, a typical project or a specific project end to end is financed. So over here, a specific project. Okay. So over here, there is a specific project. Okay. So our specific project is financed. So over here in project finance, our specific project is financed. So over here, a specific project is finance, and what is most important is it is done end to end. Okay, a specific project is financed end to end. Now, this is different from the others because in this transaction, it is the project which is more important, right? And then it is financed end to end. Now, once it is financed end to end, the next question that comes over here is how will the loans be repaid. So there are certain conditions along the charging along the description of the loans. So so how exactly, what will be the key characteristic that I will see in a project, or data to capture that whether this belongs to project finance or to a you know to a highly volatile commercial. So how do I know that? So whether it at all falls in the commercial framework. So what I do is I say that this project is financed end to end by the lending body, and and it is the cash flow that is generated by the project is something which will help us capture this characteristic, right? Okay. Okay, I think let us take a pause here today, right? And let's start afresh with project finance and the sub classification in the next session. So I will take a class tomorrow, 8 p.m. onwards again, 8 to 9:30 p.m. So please join by tomorrow. Okay, tomorrow at around 8 p.m. I will be taking a class to make up for the class I missed out last Thursday, right? So let's regroup tomorrow, and let's start afresh with the project finance and look at the different paragraphs which define and different characteristics which identify with this lending, so that we can try to next from here we'll try to assess how the models will be built, what are the characteristics broadly for the commercial portfolio, and so on. So that's the part that we'll start off with in tomorrow's discussion. So tomorrow again 8 p.m. to 9:30, right? So thank you guys. Thank you for your time today, and let's catch up tomorrow. In the meantime, I'll upload this recording into the Google Drive. Thank you.
Thanks.